Welcome to Second Table, where we discuss spirituality, philosophy, and psychology. I'm your host, Winston Janis. All right, welcome back, everyone, to the Second Table podcast. So today, Morgan Caraway is back for round two. Round two
Yeah.
of the podcast.
Round two, baby. Let's do it. Ding, ding.
Welcome. So if y'all aren't familiar with Morgan Caraway, you can go back to basically
Which you
episode
probably
one.
aren't.
It's actually, yeah, it's actually episode 2, right? It's like I did a little intro, like a 10-minute introduction to the podcast, but then you were my first interview. So,
I know. I was very honored by that.
yeah, it was a great talk, and I'm excited to do another little conversation with you, you know?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so, yeah, I know that there's been some changes, you know, in your life, some ups and downs and some twists and turns
Yeah.
since we last spoke.
That's
Um,
right. Hmm.
Yeah, anything you want to fill us in on? Just general overview, or?
Well, I kind of went through a crisis inwardly. And I don't remember, gosh, how long ago was it that we spoke? Was that like 2.5 months ago or something, or 3 months, or what was that?
Gosh, let's see. I think,
4 months?
I know that I posted, you know, those episodes of the podcast. This was early March, so it was probably not too long before that. So maybe what is it? Maybe like late February we spoke, or something like that.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So anyway, just to share the story, after we spoke, I had been kind of going through an inward crisis for a while. Probably at least it felt like since last year. And I had a period, and I don't know if we talked about this the last time, but then I had a period fairly late last year, 2019, where I just felt on top of the world, and I felt,
I remember that.
There were times I just felt basically fully awakened. I was having experiences of kind of witnessing, my body and my life almost from a different perspective, and I just felt extremely kind of euphoric overall.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, it just started kind of fading, the afterglow, and it kind of started slumping and fading, and it was a long kind of fairly drawn out drop. And I got to the point where I think one of the central features of it is, first off, my strategies that I guess the ego has developed to try to keep itself functioning quit working. And the other part was that I think I ended up with adrenal exhaustion, because I was doing quite a bit of drinking kind of in the, in the winter this year. Mm-hmm. We just had the most overcast winter here, just kind of dreary weather the whole time. And I was drinking a good bit of beer, et cetera. And I was drinking a lot of coffee too. So I ended up with adrenal exhaustion. So
I think a lot of people are going to be able to relate to that, having drinking more, right? Because with everyone's stuck at home with the coronavirus, and it's like, people are, I see that all the time on like social media, like everyone's just like, well, I'm going to come out of this with either you fixed my life or either severe alcoholism,
There's that funny meme. It says, you think our government sucks now. In 30 years, it'll be run by people who were homeschooled by day drinkers.
Right, exactly.
Like this whole crisis. But yeah, I beat the world to the crisis. It was before Corona was even anything that it started. And anyway, it culminated in this adrenal exhaustion and all these problems. And that kind of went on for a while, to the point of losing sleep at night, couldn't sleep. Panic attacks even during the nighttime. So it was pretty gnarly stuff. And one day I was just in the midst of these negative thoughts, and fear. Fear was a big feature of it. Those nagging thoughts about the future, like, oh God, what's going to happen? Picturing bad outcomes, et cetera. And I was just totally overwhelmed this particular day. And I just spontaneously, like, I didn't know what else to do. I felt in a really bad spot. I didn't know what else to do. So I just started basically chanting a mantra. And that day, the mantra was, I give you all of this, oh God. I give you all of this, because I just didn't know what to do. I think the ego was at the end of its rope. It didn't know how to proceed, how it could possibly proceed from that dark, fearful, negative space. So I just spontaneously started chanting this mantra. And amazingly, almost instantly, I felt better. And I pretty soon after that, I got the first smile on my face I'd had in a long time. And so anyway, during this crisis, I have found that my interest in God came back and my interest in spirituality. I don't remember if we talked about it last time, but I know we've mentioned it since. The show Messiah on Netflix.
Right.
When I was really in the heart of my crisis, I watched that with my dad and my stepmom. We binge watched it over a few nights when I was visiting my dad.
If you're going to give any spoilers, make sure you give a spoiler alert here.
Well, no, I know. I'm not going to give any spoilers. The only thing is, it's about a character who seems to have some kind of connection with God or source, and that's kind of the premise of the story.
I was very fascinated by the show.
A very good show, I thought. Extremely well written, extremely well cast. Just the whole presentation of it, very good. But anyway, it revealed to me just watching that show, like, I want my relationship back with God again. I want my spirituality back. Which, for some number of years, I kind of shunned it and I kind of frowned on it, as being kind of naive ideas or not being realistic enough. And I've turned my attention more towards politics, I think, for a long time. Now, if you want to be depressed and have a negative outlook, just turn your attention towards politics. It'll get you there real fast.
Right. Well, I actually, part of me got really excited to hear that you are back on this path of trying to reconnect with God and taking up an interest in reading about spirituality and those kind of things again, because you're right. For, I would say, probably most of our relationship and our friendship together, although you were interested in having those conversations with me and exploring it, you were kind of like, I don't have time to read, and kind of just like, just kind of like,
which was technically true,
right.
But, I used to read a lot of spiritual material, a lot.
Right.
And, and I know that was a talking point for us constantly. You were like, well, how about this? Have you read Thich Nhat Hanh? Or how about this? How about this?
Right,
and I was always just kind of be like, I don't know. I'm sort of already past all that stuff.
Yeah, you were good. You were all set, right?
Yeah, it felt like it. I really felt pretty good for a while, but I had these coping mechanisms. Drinking, in my case, was one of the big ones. And I think that ended up ultimately leading towards my adrenal exhaustion, And
right.
So I haven't drank in months now. It's been months.
How you feeling?
And I feel better in that regard, Well, the other thing is I haven't drank coffee. And coffee was my morning routine. I did 2 cups a day every day for a while of half calf, but big mugs of it. Big mugs of half calf. So that, of course, I think probably, figured into the adrenal exhaustion thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, physically, I feel good. I feel pretty much good energy. Most of the time now, I don't feel like I need caffeine anymore. And honestly, I don't even really have a thirst for beer or drinking. Occasionally, I'll dream about it. And in my dream, I'll drink and I'll be like, oh, damn, I drank again.
Wow. Yeah. Oh man, I'm not quite at that level. I mean, I have, pretty much given up caffeine. I love the taste of coffee, but pretty much because of anxiety, I cut out the caffeine, but gosh, you're going to have to, carry me away kicking and screaming from my craft beers.
No, I do understand that. I do understand that. I think for some people it's a maintainable thing, but I think for me it was way tied up in my ego kind of one of its survival strategies, basically.
Yeah.
And, the ego is always in a state of not really being settled or calm or still.
Mm.
I would argue maybe the ego is kind of this nervous movement and energy. And I think one way it maintains itself and gives itself a sense of security is habits.
Yeah, the habit of checking your phone and your news feed.
Exactly.
I mean, gosh, that is definitely, I noticed this. It just contributes to the restless energy and but you want to do it. It's that dopamine hit. It's like, oh, what's the
Of
next
course.
new thing? What's the next new thing?
They have teams of psychologists and people, the big social media platforms, et cetera. And
what's gonna grab your attention?
Right. It's all reward. It's little stimulus, reward. Now it's, in a crazy way, to look at it on Facebook, your reward a lot of times is a brain full of bad news. You're looking through your feed. What are you going to come out of it with? A lot of times a brain full of bad news or people's kind of negative reactions to various kind of things happening in the news. And then, of course, conspiracy stuff, which I know you get a chuckle out of some of that. And, there's just, I don't know. I guess there is that sense of connection. And I think that's the thing we're in it for, really, is to connect. I would think,
Yeah, you're right. It's like, you feel a little less isolated when you're like, well, what's going on with the world? Let me see what, especially when you're stuck at home or whatever for long periods of time, you're like, I want to see what's going on in the world. What are the people doing? What are they, you feel like you're a part of life when you're looking at all that stuff,
Right. I think especially with the quarantine, everybody, I think people are even more hungry for connection now.
Right. It's always going to be more difficult to have the authentic connections that actually nourish you rather than the the fake connections that you get from the social media, feeling like you're part of life but not actually being engaged.
Right. We should mention to people that we've had this little group discussing spirituality with our friend Dave Roper and our friend Rock.
Right.
And that has been a little bright spot for me, having kind of a virtual satsang with friends. I found that to be nice,
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's a little church in a way that we got, right? Because like I said, to see that there's, I mean, in a lot of ways, our paths have intersected already, but now that you're on this path of trying to like seek out God, I really resonate with that, and feel like I am also on the same page with you in a lot of ways, because I also am always striving to have some sort of a relationship with God. And it's like, I think, so like, I've gone through periods in which I've really struggled with prayer, and here I am, right, about to be ordained pastor, right? And it's like, but this is real, this is human, and and it's like, I think that's partly a result of going through a deconstruction, right? So as we've talked about before, like a deconstruction means that, I was raised with the sort of dominant Christian beliefs that people have, and, raised to sort of pretty much more or less take the Bible literally and all that Christian stuff. And then, you go to seminary and you get exposed to all this different stuff, and you realize, okay, maybe everything that I believed wasn't exactly true or correct in the way that I thought it was. And it's a really mind-boggling experience to go through. And I think that's part of what we, like I've talked about with a lot of other people on the podcast, is that part of what makes a faith or a path a living one is that it continues to change and evolve. It doesn't stay the same. It doesn't stay static. If it's static, then it's dead in a way, right?
Right.
So this was a healthy thing for my own spiritual journey. But I think it left me with a sort of skepticism. It's kind of like when you're told that Santa's not real, right?
Right.
It's like all of a sudden you're like, really?
I ain't never buying that again. Right. You're
Precisely.
like, yeah, exactly.
So,
No, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I think so many people, for them, the word God even has negative connotations because they've either seen people who are hypocritical about their religion, or they've seen people who persecuted others in the name of God. So I think for a lot of people, or they may have suffered abuse, themselves in the name of God or religion. So I think a lot of people get a negative connotation about it.
yeah.
And for me, I just feel like I wrote something down earlier. I've got it in my phone. But if God is separate, it means God is limited. So if you conceive of a God that is separate from you, you're also admitting that it's limited by definition. And I think, unfortunately, Christianity has ended up where most Christians think God is somebody out there, someone or something out there who you petition for things you want and you need or you think should happen in the world, etc. So I think that's unfortunate because I think we don't look inward, where I feel like we probably should be looking to make that connection.
Well, here's the paradox, right? Is I feel as though you're right that the path for us, and to a large degree, is to look inward, to look within for God, and that's what all the great sages and mystics and teachers throughout the ages have said. And yet, at the same time, I think that there is a sense in which we need a God that is larger than us, that is able to hold more than we can hold, because there are so many times in life where, I'm reminded of like when I was listening to Jack Kornfield and he was talking about, gosh, I don't know if I can remember all the details of the story, but how he advised a therapist that he was working with to have an altar behind her and to put all the different gods, Buddha and Mother Mary and Jesus and, Our Lady Guadalupe and, Ganesh and all these different things, because you need backup, right? That we need to, we can't hold all of the world on our shoulders and all of this, especially in today's world when you're being bombarded by the news, like you said, and all the things going on in the media. And it's like you feel overwhelmed. And just like you said, you're the mantra you used. I give this all to you, God.
Yeah.
Right?
And you know what I realized about that afterwards is, the ego is the idea of who we are. It's that image. And, it's this, it's very limited. The ego's capacity, I've told Dave Roper, one of my more recent definitions for ego is an insufficient response to the present. So that can it can be looked at in that way. But I told Dave not long ago, I was like, so it seems to me in that moment that I was communicating with him, I was like, it seems we're moving from something of very limited capacity, the ego, to something of infinite capacity, God. And I'm even speaking of that in the sense of something within us. To me, the great sages and, like Jesus and the sages and the saints, they've all said, God is within. The kingdom of heaven is within, is the way Jesus put it. And this is said again and again in all these different traditions. So I feel like it's just if we can see past the ego and get past the ego, then we can be in touch with that part of ourselves that is limitless and has infinite capacity.
I mean, yeah, I think, well, for me, it's like one of the things I have to continually remind myself is, as it relates to meditation, they say one of the things that has continually come up repeatedly is don't try to stop your thoughts, but change your relationship with your thoughts, right? So when thoughts come up, you're going to get into trouble if you're going to say, well, every thought that pops up is a problem. But if you can start to change the relationship and say, okay, well, this stream of thoughts is just something that is happening, and I don't have to necessarily be completely caught up in it.
Right.
That is already going to change things and shift things. And I think it's the same thing with the ego, right? I mean, what is the ego except this stream of thoughts as well,
Right.
that we identify with? And so I don't think that it's, I don't know if it's necessarily the way I would phrase it of trying to get past it, but to change our relationship to the ego, because I don't know if I don't think we're necessarily going to get rid of the ego. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. There's different, some say you can, some say you can't. And as you say, really the ego is just thoughts. But the ego is sort of like the imagined thinker of the thoughts. The ego is sort of this bundle of thoughts that we imagine gives rise to thought. And I would also say the ego is the part of us that struggles, that judges, that, a lot of these things, that's coming from the place of the ego. Now, most people think they are the ego. Mm-hmm. When you ask them, who are you? They will say, I am, blank, blank, blank. Here's my name. Here's my qualities. So for most of us, for most of our lives, I think we are that image. And we live, kind of in the confines of that image to some extent. But, as you know, I've been into non-duality for a long time. And one of the central themes there is that the actual core of our experience is consciousness. And that's what these thoughts appear in, and including the thoughts that purport to be the ego. And it's what the body appears in. It's what, of course, the entire phenomenal universe appears in.
Just the awareness itself.
Right.
Right.
So I find, I did another Douglas Harding experiment last night. And, for those who don't know, I think Douglas's most famous book was On Having No Head. And it's kind of his approach to Zen, his kind of direct experiential approach to finding out who we are.
It's an attention grabber. It's definitely unique.
Yeah, he was, he was kind of hounded by these questions of who am I really? And he worked at it for years and years and did these books with these incredible complex formulas and other things. But anyway, I did another one of his experiments last night. And it was pretty profound because he basically says, close your eyes. Now, based on present evidence, not thinking about it, not, not remembering who you think you are and all that. Just close your eyes. And based on present evidence, what are you? And he kind of leads you through this thing. And, I know we have the story of who we are. And I'm still struggling with that story, meaning, it's still a kind of these habits that I have that have been, I think, part of this ego thing. The habits are still kind of running, the habits are still, the program is still active. Mm-hmm. So, I feel in a way like the mantra and meditation, I have been definitely trying to meditate more. I feel like those are ways to counteract that old programming. It's kind of like putting a new program in the mix. And also, I think meditation, what you're trying to get to is just the simple fact of being, basically.
It's funny that you use that analogy, because I know that I think it's like Cynthia Bourgeois and Richard Rohr a little bit, but particularly her. Richard Rohr is popular in the kind of progressive Christian circles and stuff like that. And they use that analogy of that really what Jesus was teaching was a kind of non-dual consciousness, and that
Sure.
It's really they use the software analogy that you're uploading completely new operating system into
Right.
our way of experiencing and relating to the world.
Right.
As seeing as not separate from, all things are not separate. All things are in this unified kind of dimension,
Right. Well, as we've talked about, and I'm sorry if I interrupted, but
No,
I'll
it's
just
fine.
real briefly say this. Jesus, if you look at his message and what he was doing, was a yogi, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's right out of the, Advaita Vedanta and the Vedas and the Hindu tradition. And then, of course, Buddhism comes out of the same tradition. But I agree with you. I feel like Jesus's best stuff was all sort of saying, like, you're living in this ego thing and you're asleep. You're living as if you're dead, stuck in this thing. But the kingdom of God is within. We can wake up to this, and we are one with this. So I totally agree with you that his message was very non-dual. And, to me, honestly, the only philosophy that ever felt truly right to me is like non-duality and Advaita Vedanta. And then, of course, like my book, Ecological Awakening, it's talking about non-duality in physical terms, that we are one with our environment. And all this is very, I think, logical, and there's nothing arcane about that in the least.
Right.
But yeah, Jesus was, he was sort of, he seems to me, if you look at him where he was, he's like, who the hell is this guy? Where did he come from? Look at, what is he talking about? Just love your enemies? Who is this guy? Love your enemies?
Yeah.
But if you look at him in that Hindu tradition, and, where Buddhism and all that comes from, and the yogis and their way of living and the miracles, that's all. He was basically like a yogi, for as far as I can tell.
Mm. Yeah, and I know, right, that's one of the things that shocks Christians. Like when I was reading Barbara Brown Taylor's book, right, she talks about how that a lot of Christians are shocked to discover that within other spiritual traditions, a lot of them do have reverence for Jesus, like within the Muslim tradition and Islam, they regard Jesus as a prophet.
Yeah, the Hindu saints that I'm familiar with, they all considered him just a saint and awakened one.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people love Jesus besides Christians, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But to tie it back into kind of one of the topics that we're maybe revolving around tonight is prayer and developing a relationship with God, when maybe intellectually you might be very skeptical of that. It's like Jesus we talk about in this non-dual consciousness. It's like, well, Jesus also, while saying, I and the Father are one, also prayed to the Father, right?
Right.
And
right.
I just think about that experience of you talking about that mantra. And, recently you shared a quote with me that made an impact, the actor, Peter O'Toole.
Yeah.
And I said, if I can recall it from memory, when did I find out that I was God? Well, I just realized that when I was praying suddenly, that I was talking to myself. And, I don't know, some people might, kind of maybe be offended at that or something like that. But I find it fascinating because it shows that it's like what you were talking about, this tension between how do we conceive of a God. See, I think that people get afraid of that, afraid of looking for God within, because then they're afraid that what we're going to do is we're going to equate God with the ego. You see what I'm saying? And that is a dangerous thing. We don't want to make ego into God. What we want to do is still maintain a distinction. But what we're saying, I think, is that this stuff is within us because we are a part of the larger, we're an expression of the larger cosmos. And so, although the ego is a part of us, the awareness, the heart
is even
of
more
God,
central.
all of that is still within us because we are a creation and an expression of the cosmos and a creation expression of God. That means that all of those things are to be found within us as well, that God is experiencing through us. So it's like, I understand the danger, but I do think that absolutely we can also, even though the ego is to be found within us, that doesn't mean that God is not to be found within us. God is to be found within us.
Right. I think, like you said, there's this danger that the ego will, take in this idea, I am God. And we've seen a lot of gurus who have gone down very dark paths and led their followers down very horrific, dark paths, But I think, we're talking about Jesus, saying on one hand, I and the Father are one, and then praying. I feel like it can be the body can be speaking to the consciousness within it. And the mind, the thoughts can be speaking to the consciousness within, because that's what registers everything anyway, is that consciousness. Like when you're talking to God, that consciousness is registering and it is hearing what you're saying. It's taking it all in. So we all have like a perfect little transmission piece to talk to God within us already.
Right. It's like you said, how can we possibly be separate from God? If God is infinite and limitless, I mean, to say that we're separate from God, as you pointed out,
is limiting God.
Is limiting God.
It's limiting God.
So, you're right. And that's a major shift that's happened recently for me, because I've read people like I interviewed Paul Knitter on the podcast, and then John Shelby Spong, who's known as kind of like, almost like a very humanistic or atheist. I think even you're familiar a little bit with John Shelby Spong. He's a Episcopal bishop, I believe, and he takes a very sort of humanistic, and some people would even say almost atheistic approach to religion, right? Where he just thinks we got to do away with so many of the sort of dominant Christian, perspectives. And what was my point though? That sorry, I need to back up here. I lost my train of thought.
I don't know exactly where we were headed.
Sorry. It's come back to me. So that like him and Paul Knitter were saying that there are times, and I know even like, I think Carl Jung talked about this, a lot of his patients, that when they pray, there comes a certain point in their development as adults where all of a sudden prayer starts to seem very inauthentic. And it's like, you just feel like you're talking to yourself and there's really no one out there. And I can relate to that to some extent. Like I said, that skeptical part of myself, like, is there anyone out there? And I think part of what has helped me, is seeing the union between the things and seeing that, okay, maybe I have to change my perception of God as not necessarily this all-powerful external force that acts on things and forces things to happen and subdues things, and instead the life force itself that is bubbling up within us. And it reminds me, I went on a Zen, actually it was a Zen Christian retreat in the Providence Zen Center. And I met with, during the meditation with a Catholic priest and one of the Zen teachers, which at the same time was really cool. A little consultation. And I kind of brought up this issue, my struggle with, kind of the influence that Buddhist tradition has had over me, while at the same time wanting to retain my Christian identity and relationship with God. And I was like saying, well, I don't know, it's hard to kind of think of God in a personal way. But, I think one of the teachers there was saying, what can be more personal when you look within, and God is this thing that is essentially your deepest self, and what is nearer to you than your own breathing? What can be more personal than that? So when you shift that perspective to say, this life that you're experiencing as yourself is in some way also the life of God, what can possibly be more personal than that? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, if all people are manifestations of that, then exactly. Then every personal relationship we have is a relationship with God.
When you finally discover this God that is somehow larger than yourself, in other words, larger than your ego, you still discover that somehow it's so intimate to you that it is you.
It is you. That's what strikes me, and that's what struck me, that day when I was just at the end of my rope. I felt totally overwhelmed. My brain was racing with all these negative and fearful thoughts. And I couldn't, the ego couldn't handle it anymore. The ego's like, I'm done. There's nothing I can do here. There's nothing I can do to make this right. It's too heavy. The load is too big. And that was the prayer that came, the mantra. It was basically just a prayer, but I just kept repeating it just to change my mindset and my focus. And I give this all to you, oh God. And,
the work of getting beyond ourselves is still a necessary work, right?
I think so. Now as you know, and probably you know this, but in the non-duality circles, having a practice is kind of frowned on. It's like, oh, we're already God, so you don't need to have a practice to get closer to God. You don't, Now I would say that's probably what people call neo-Advaita, like the more modern sort of westernized version of it. Because, people such as Neem Karoli Baba, who, he seemed to really be in touch with Source, Truth, God. He of course, they did talk about different techniques. And that tradition talks about different techniques, the Eastern tradition, of course, meditation, prayer, mantras, so many different approaches. But, like we've talked about recently a lot, I feel like, we were born and raised in a very materialistic, outwardly focused culture. So all we've ever really known, all we've done, and I can at least speak for myself, for my whole life, I've looked to the world for my sense of peace, my sense of security, my sense of well-being, and my sense of fulfillment, in all these material objects in the world. And I think, kind of the recent crisis I've been through is just pointing, none of that really works. If I can't find the peace in myself, the peace that passeth all understanding, it has been called, then you're forever kind of at the whims of an ever-changing universe.
Right.
Your internal sense of well-being is always at the whim of this mercurial life.
Gosh, especially today, right? It's like we're just everything around us is telling us what we need to be happy. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about what you've said, and I've heard people like Thich Nhat Hanh say, is that there's so very few conditions that really need to be met in order for us to be happy. There are important conditions, but
food, air, place to sleep, the body has its needs.
Right.
And, but I think spiritually, inwardly, I think there are so few things we really need. Yeah, and, being outwardly focused leads to a lot of suffering. I mean, ultimately, that's the second noble truth. Attachment leads to suffering. And I think in that case, Buddha is saying when you're attached to anything in this ever-changing universe, it's going to lead to suffering.
Right.
When you're attached to anything external, it's going to lead to suffering.
Yeah, right. I think that we can still enjoy, of course, all the things of this world, but to do it in a way that we kind of recognize that all of these things are impermanent. And,
exactly right.
These things are not here to stay, and that's just a reality, right? That's just the nature of life. And so it's part of the challenge is to how do we go and move through life with grace, knowing all that.
Right.
It's not an easy question by any means.
Some traditions claim there is spirit, and that basically spirit is immaterial, meaning it's not born, it doesn't die, that it's what, if we think of it as consciousness, at least being a facet of spirit, then it's what the world appears in and it's what the world disappears in, So, there is that idea, and I've been kind of putting my toe back into that idea again, putting my toe in the water. It's like, I think that's a beautiful idea.
Can you restate the idea one more time?
Well, just the idea of, God often referred to as a spirit, I guess as immaterial, as formless. And consciousness in our experience is the part of us that, witnesses and takes in everything. but it in itself doesn't have any particular form.
Yeah, I think this gets at, once again, the theme we're sort of returning to tonight is the concept of God and okay, we're talking about prayer and having a relationship with God. What are we talking about, right? It's like, because God is this indefinable something, or nothing, however you want to.
Right.
And so, what is that doing to us psychologically when we say, whoever it is, whether it's Jesus or Richard Rohr or Maharaji, when they're talking about God and fixing the mind on God, when we know that we cannot have an actual conception of God, right? That any conception that we have of God is not the actual God, reality of God. I think it's somehow, all I can think of is that it's the totality. It's taking a larger perspective, and it's also infusing our everyday, ordinary experiences, all of them, with a sense of sacredness, a sense of holiness.
Right.
Instead of just looking at it as trivial and meaningless, to say no, right? Because actually, I was going to make a blog post about this, but when I was walking in the forest yesterday, I thought to myself, I was thinking about all the people who practice mindfulness and how, the Buddhists often get accused of being atheistic or not believing in God, right? But I'm thinking to myself, what greater act of worship could there possibly be than giving your full attention to every experience of life when you take each step, when you take each breath?
Right.
Because what other true experience of God can we have? The God comes to us in the form of the world and of each other. Right.
Yeah, I hear you. And I've been reading this guy, Siddharameshwar, who was Nisargadatta's guru, and he's kind of a mixture of a devotional path and the Nani, the knowledge path of knowledge. But and this is something I also read in Ram Dass's book, Polishing the Mirror. By, for example, keeping a mantra going inwardly. Like I realized recently, my oldest mantra is "Thank you, God." And there was a period years ago where I was going through some kind of rough stuff inwardly, and I just kept trying to be thankful, regardless of what was coming up. So occasionally I would remember that prayer, or fairly frequently I would remember it. "Thank you, God." And now I try, and I find that mantra being the front of my consciousness a good bit. And of course I lose the thread, I forget, I do other stuff. But if we can treat, like you're saying, every everyday experience as sacred, it can be any experience. It can be eating a meal. It can be walking. It can be, if we're just thankful for each experience and give it to God.
Right.
Give each experience. It can be sex. It can be whatever.
Right. What a mistake it seems to have been, from my perspective, for us to have, in the history of spirituality, whether Christian or otherwise, to divorce the material world and earthly experience from our sense of the spiritual and what we think of as God. That we've separated those things instead of seeing that creation and God are they have this intimate relationship with one another.
Well, it's all the same. The consciousness and the appearance, the manifestation is all it. That's the Hindu idea of Brahman, the ultimate reality. It's all pervading, and it ultimately is everything.
Well, I guess
now, the Hindus have a little more ascetic approach. That's the right word, right? Ascetic. Yeah. And their approach, a lot of it. Now, I think within Hinduism, there's probably many, many different approaches, but their thing is, if you get too focused on the outward material aspect of God, you will neglect the inner aspect, and you will suffer from clinging to it. And,
Right.
that's reflected in Buddhism and reflected in Hinduism and probably some of the other great religions as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And also add to that, right? I was thinking to myself, okay, why do we divorce the two, right? Because there is so much suffering. It seems
Right.
really inherent almost into, ordinary human existence or any physical existence for that matter. And so how do we make sense of that, right? Which is an ongoing sort of struggle that we wrestle with is how do we make sense with all of the bad things, right?
Well, the way we talked about that not long ago and the way I would still explain it, and, I think Peter Rollins, right?
Yeah.
Y'all were discussing it, but there has to be contrast for anything to appear. There has to be dark and light, pain and pleasure, all of these. There has to be this gamut of possible experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So for pleasure to appear, you have to have pain.
Right.
For light to appear, you have to have dark.
Yeah, it's still in many ways, it's still the best sort of the best I can do in terms of making sense of it. To be honest, yeah, whether you phrase it that way or whether you phrase it that, as I've heard other spiritual teachers articulate it, that really these experiences of struggle oftentimes have something to teach us that we have the opportunity to grow and deepen through those experiences. I mean, it reminds me actually of, I came across, I'd love to interview her at some point, Cynthia Bourgeau, who works closely with Richard Rohr. And I'm reading her book, Wisdom Jesus. You might even be interested in it because she talks about Jesus almost from the perspective of like a yogi, right? That a tantric master, a teacher of non-dual consciousness. And she's, I'm at a section right now where she's giving an interesting non-dual interpretation of Jesus's Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And she's giving this interesting non-dual interpretation of each one. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And it was a really interesting interpretation where she says, true mourning, that experience of loss, it just totally, like you said, the ego has like nowhere to go. The ego is just, I don't even know how I can articulate the way she did, but the ego is just sort of beyond, it has to go beyond itself because it just cannot cope, cannot deal with that. And so she describes it as like this liminal space between the realms, where paradoxically you go to this, like, it's like you're loving something that isn't there anymore, but you still cannot help but love. And somehow, I can't really speak to this personally, but it's like you hear these experiences of people realizing they find God somehow in those spaces. I don't know if that's necessarily true, obviously, for everyone, but I've heard these accounts of like people feeling as though something reaches out in the darkness. Paradoxically, I'd love to talk to some of those individuals who have said that. I mean,
well, I think it's simply that case of what we're talking about. Like the ego is a thing of very limited capacity. And, I think ultimately you could say it doesn't exist. But in our day-to-day practical experience, most of us living on the earth today think we are the ego.
Right.
So it's what we call me. Yeah. But I feel like you're exactly right. Like because it is of such, limited capacity, there's many things that can completely overwhelm it, including itself. It can overwhelm itself just by struggling. I've had a tendency towards struggling with negative thoughts and such. And of course, that's just the ego. And of course, it gets worse. The more you struggle, the worse it gets. And it can exhaust itself.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's Eckhart Tolle's story. He said he was fighting in his ego and he just got completely exhausted and said, I can't stand myself anymore.
Right.
And then he had a thought like, who is the me that can't stand myself? And,
Right. Well, what it gets me to think, it's another way of putting it, right, when we're talking about suffering and mourning and all that, is that those things, it's like it breaks down everything in life that is transient and is temporary, and it almost like it forces us to discover that which is eternal.
Say it, eternal.
Right? It's like,
yeah.
Like, right, through
exactly.
a process of discovering. It's like, I think Jack Kornfield said it at one point when I was listening to one of his talks. I don't know if I can remember exactly how he phrased it, but it's like, by going through the process of destruction, you find that which within yourself that is indestructible. How else could you find that which is indestructible but by things being destroyed? I mean, it's just, and of course,
that's exactly right.
Yeah. And I mean,
I
nobody wants to go through that process.
Nobody wants it. There's very few who would intentionally go through such a thing. And if I'm honest with myself, this crisis I went through recently, I would have kept my habits. I would still be doing a lot of drinking, and I would still be drinking 2 coffees a day. And, I would have. And
everybody right now who drinks 2 cups or more is feeling real judged right now, Morgan.
Well, I mean, adrenal exhaustion will in itself cause you to make some changes. You remember before, and that's a funny story, that Cinco de Mayo when we made some giant margaritas. This is many years ago. And I did one, and it took me way over the edge. And I had my first panic attack that next morning. I think that was like 2012 or 13, somewhere in there. Right. But anyway, believe me, that stuff will motivate some change in your life. I mean, it motivated me to be at the point now where I'm like, I will never touch alcohol again. I will never, a drop will not pass my lips. And I tell people that. But anyway, my central point is I would never have chosen to put those habits away. My rational, or my, the ego basically would not have chosen to do it. But it took intense suffering and, everything the ego was doing to sustain itself being called into question to loosen that grasp. And, the ego just got to the point. It's at the end of its rope. There's nothing it could do. I mean, everything it's trying is failing miserably, might I add. So it just, then, it couldn't be sustained.
Yeah. And then at the end of the day, it seems like we have to practice trust, right? One way or another.
Yeah. But I mean, we're in this life thing and it's happening. And we're deep in it. I mean, we're balls deep in it. And I just think, I'm very thankful I didn't end up getting institutionalized, or I didn't end up just, having a full, complete nervous breakdown where I laid in bed in my bathrobe for 2 months or something. I'm very thankful it didn't come to that. So I do realize there's room for gratitude.
Is that a bathrobe you're wearing right now, Morgan? Or?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. If you catch me at nighttime, I get all my filthy day clothes off. And I have said before, I consider it a very successful day when you don't have to change out of your bathrobe once. Yeah. And those are rare. Unfortunately.
Well, man, it's been a great talk. I see we're coming to the end of our time. But, man, I don't know, Morgan, what do you think in this time of coronavirus and election season and all the craziness in the world? Do you have a mantra for us?
Peace is within. Peace is within. And if you would have told me that 2 months ago, I would have thought you were insane. I thought I was bereft of peace, is the way it felt. But I feel like the only hope we have to have lasting peace is to find it in ourselves. Yeah, to trust that those inner resources are there, that God, that God is there. God is there with us and in us. And I mean, you know it, I know it. I've had my share of panic attacks too. So I know that there are times when you don't feel God at all, it seems. And God feels like the furthest thing from you. But that to trust that we do have those capacities within us to find peace. I think you're right in that respect, and that's not to minimize how hard it can be, but no, because when the ego is in that thrashing, struggling mode, it's going to be first and foremost in your consciousness. Right. And if you don't mind, I would like to tell people that Douglas Harding series.
Sure.
On YouTube, it's called "Look Who's Here." Is the name of the series, and there's different experiments that can be done. There's a part 1, A, B, and C, a part 2, A and B, and a part 3, A and B. But if you just type in "Look Who's Here" and then like a 1A or a 1B, it'll come up. And the experiment I did last night was the 1C. That's where the people he's talking to said, the guy said, your whole thing seems to be visual. Is this limited to only people who can see? What about blind people? Or he says, does it also apply to the other senses? So that was Look Who's Here, part 1C. And I felt that to be pretty magical. Just closing the eyes. You're focusing on his voice, so there's not a whole lot of internal dialogue. And I felt like it was magical. So anyway,
sounds like sounds like a great experiment to undertake while under quarantine. Under lockdown, yeah.
I mean, I think it's a perfect time to find inner peace if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's for a lot of us, it's a very stressful, very difficult time, but I think it does have some opportunities for us, for those of us who are able to have some time of quiet or rest or solitude. We might be able to grow in unexpected ways potentially.
Right.
Yeah.
When I was in the worst part of my crisis, the two things I prayed for was rest and peace. Those are the two things I prayed for, and both came to me.
Yeah, man. Great. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to kind of come out of that experience and have some good spiritual nourishment come out of it. So thanks for coming on again. It was great talking.
Love you, brother.
Love you too, Morgan. And until next time, I hope you'll be back to join us again soon.
Sure, man. Let's do it.
All right. Bye. Thanks for listening, everyone.